You know, they did ask the speakers to say, like, what is the song you want to walk on? And that was not the song that I requested. But I was watching Evan over here, and I was looking at the circle. I was like, if I walk over here, but now I can go like, oh, hello. But yeah, anyways, so I'll try to stay over here. But today, I'm going to be talking to you guys about the Vue 3's composition API. I work at Vue Mastery, where we teach Vue visually, much like I'll be teaching this talk. So the next 3 talks, we're all going to be discussing the composition API. And I'm going to start at the very beginning. I'm going to give you guys the basics. Oh, yeah. Hi. I guess I'll stay over here. I am not talking about Vue 3 reactivity. I'll leave that for Sarah Dresner tomorrow morning. So don't drink too much tonight. So really, I'm going to be talking about why it's needed, reactive references, methods, computer properties, reactive versus ref, and modularizing. It's a basic introduction. Some of you might already are familiar with this stuff, but the goal is to get everyone up to speed so we can get into the more advanced topics in the next 2 talks. So first of all, why do we need a composition API? What are the limitations of Vue 2? Well, really it has to do with readability as components grow and get bigger. Code reuse patterns have drawbacks. I'll be going into that and how the composition API gives us a better solution. And then limited TypeScript support, all of which have been touched upon this morning at some point. So let's go into this in a little deeper. The first limitation, large components can become hard to read and maintain. So let's dive into this and make sure we all understand what that looks like. I'm going to give you guys a code example. We'll be following through during this talk. It's going to be a basic search component, right? It might look something like this. How would we code this up using traditional Vue component syntax? Well, we might have export default, and we've got our data, and we have some methods, potentially. And our code goes in between here. But our component obviously is going to add, we're going to add more features as we go along. We might need to add some sorting functionality. What do we do there? Well, that goes in with our search functionality inside our component. So we have code split up. We have our search functionality and we have our sorting functionality split up between our different component options. And we might want to add additional features like search and pagination, like filters and pagination. So what we're doing here is logical concerns or features are organized by component options. And there might be additional ones like components, props, data, computed, methods, lifecycle methods. These are all our different component options. Oh, the light just changed. All right. So as this gets bigger, as you can imagine, we've got all these different pieces of our component using the different component options, and our code for each of these features is spread out through our component, which makes things less maintainable, hard to read. Wouldn't it be nicer if we could organize this by logical concerns? So all of our code is in the same place for each feature. And that's really what the composition API makes it easier to do. So let's do that with our example, our very simple example. So we want to take our code and put it all together. Like that. Yes. And now everything's more readable and maintainable because the code for each feature is located all together. And if we were using the composition API, we'd have to put it inside that setup function, right? And inside that setup function, that's where we have our new syntax. And as was mentioned earlier, it's completely optional. We still have our old syntax. We still have the main syntax that most people using Vue are going to use, the option syntax, until they need something different. But when I first saw this, I don't know about you, when I first saw this, I was like, wait a second, we're writing all this code inside this one huge setup method? Is that really how this is going to work? Well, no, what you're going to end up most likely doing is organizing things into component functions, into composition functions. So I might have a use search composition function, and I have a use sorting composition function. And then inside of my setup function, that's where I might go and invoke each of those. That's probably more likely how you're going to organize things, not just all inside this one big setup function. All right, so now our code can be more organized by logical concerns. But that doesn't necessarily mean that our user interface now has components. Don't get this confused with components, right? It's not like I'm going to write a piece of code and I'm going to have a composition function for all the different parts of my page. No, no, no. I'm still going to use good component design and encapsulate different pieces of my user interface into their own components. All right. So that's the first limitation. What's the second limitation? Well, there's no optimal way to reuse logic between components. So what does that look like? When it comes to extracting functionality, I've got a couple different options you've all probably used, right? There's 3 ways in Vue 2 to extract things. The first, of course, is mixins. What does that look like? So for our example here, we can split out our code to 2 different mixins. We might have a product search mixin, and we also have a result sort mixin. And then inside of our component, we specify our different mixins, and they get included inside of our code. So great. I'm going to shorten the code here just to make it a little more readable. So now we are organized by feature. However, we can easily end up with property name conflicts. It's not clear how these mixins interact. And we can't reuse the code to also search and sort things like reviews or sellers or shipping options. All right, so that's mixins. One way we can get around that, so we can reuse this code in different places, is maybe use a mixin factory. That's our second solution. So in here, we might have a search factory, look something like this. We might also have our sorting factory, look something like that. And then inside of our search component, we include our mixin factories. Then inside of our code, we specify our different mixins and our different pieces of configuration for each part of those mixins, which then get called and sucked into our component. So great. So now everything is easily reusable. We can reuse this code. We have clearer relationships of how our features interact. Namespacing, the disadvantage here, namespacing requires strong conventions and discipline. We still have to look inside each mixin to see what properties is exposed, and mixin factories can't be dynamically generated. So still not a perfect solution. The third way we could solve this problem would be with scoped slots. So here we have a generic search scope slot, looks something like this. We send in some props, you can see we have a slot. We also have a generic sorting, which again has some props, has some functionality, and then our slot. So you can see here, all of our logic, all of our features are encapsulated inside of this generic component. And then inside of our search component, that's where we use these scope slots, right? And they get included appropriately. So what are the benefits and drawbacks here? Well, benefits, it solves a lot of the problems we were having with mixins. Things are encapsulated. However, you might not like that it increases indentation in your template. And also, I think sort of the biggest disadvantage is configuration. A lot of my configuration might now be inside my template. And I don't know about you, but something doesn't feel clean to me about putting a lot of logic and configuration in my template. I want my template to be as stupid as possible, as simple as possible. So it doesn't really feel great to put configuration there, personally. It's also less flexible. Exposed properties like product search are only available on the template. And now we have 3 components instead of 1, which means it's less performant. It might not make that big of a difference, but it's less performant. All right, so now let's look at solving this using a composition function. So here I would have perhaps a search.js here at the top. So here's my composition function. I'm not going to show you the code, but the code inside each of these pieces, that would be using our creating a composition function using the new composition API. Then I just include them in my component. Then I'm going to use that setup method, and I'm going to call them from inside the setup method and return whatever I need to expose to the template, which we'll get into later. And my configuration now is where I think it belongs, which is inside of my code, in this case, inside of my setup method. There's my configuration. Benefits here. Less code. It's easier to pull a feature from your component into its own function. It builds on your existing skills since you're already familiar with functions. It's more flexible than mix-ins and scope slots. Since they're just functions, IntelliSense, autocomplete, typings are already going to work in your code editor. Only real downside here is that now we have two different syntaxes to create components, which from a framework perspective, building a framework would be less than optimal. However, I think, as you can see, this is well needed and well used. So let's jump into it. So the next step, we haven't shown you the composition API syntax yet, but we'll get into that in a second. But I first have to emphasize two things. The first is, again, this is simply additive, right? All previous component syntax is valid. People will still be using the options API as they code up their Vue apps. In fact, most people will do that, I think. This is a more advanced optional syntax. So let's get really clear on when to use it. When should we be using this, right? So first is if you're a big TypeScript fan, right? Using this allows you to use TypeScript in a more powerful way inside of your component code. So that might be a good enough reason to use it for you. Also, of course, when your component gets really large and needs to be organized by feature. So you create component composition functions in that case. So that's a good reason to use this. Thirdly, when you need to reuse code across other components. This is a good pattern for sharing code, especially, as Evan mentioned this morning, when you're creating plugins or reusable libraries. That's a good reason to use it as well. And then lastly, if you and your team prefer the alternate syntax and you all kind of agree, hey, we like this better than using the option syntax, that might be a good reason as well, as long as you're all on the same page. All right, let's get into the code. But I have to give a disclaimer. The code I'm going to be showing you is very simple. The composition API, you might argue, is unnecessary in this case, but of course my goal is to teach everybody. So just keep that in mind. This is really simple. You might not use it in this case, but let's jump into the code. All right, so I'm going to show you guys some basic Vue options API syntax. We have a capacity, and we have one reactive property called capacity in there, right? So it's going to look something like this. Simply taking it, printing out to the page. Let's figure out how to use the composition API to do something very simple, and we'll go from there. So first step, as we mentioned, we declare that setup method. Now the setup method executes before components, props, status, methods, computer properties, lifecycle methods, and because of that, it does not have access to this. So that's why it has some parameters, or arguments. And the first one is props, right? And it's reactive. The props are reactive. As they change, they can be watched. So let's take a look at what that looks like. Basic code might be something like this, where we have a prop to send in, and we'll use that. We need to, if we want to watch it, we need to include watch, and then we can specify every time this particular prop gets updated, let's console log it out. Simple example of how you might use this. The second argument here, the second argument is context. So that's how we get access to everything we'd normally get access to using this. So it looks something like this. Right, so, and we can get access to attributes, slots, parent, root, and emit from here. In our case, we don't need any of this. All we need to do as a next step to replicate what you just saw is first we need a reactive reference. We need a reactive property. In this case, we're going to create a constant of capacity. It's a reactive reference, and it basically wraps our primitive in an object, allowing us to track changes. Right, so previously, we were using data to wrap our primitives. Now we're using a reactive reference. And the nice thing about the way Vue 3 is coded up is that we can easily take all of the reactivity that's now inside Vue 3 because it's very modular, and we can even use it outside of Vue. We can use maybe just the pieces that we need, which makes it really modular and even easier to extract just the pieces we need into shared libraries. All right. So now, the next step here is we need to return the variables and functions that our template will need. So we need to specify, okay, the template up above needs access to capacity. Now, we didn't need to do this before with Vue 2. But there's a big benefit you get from specifying what the template gets access to. It makes our component more maintainable, and now we can directly control what gets exposed, and it makes it easier when we need to debug. So where is a property defined? Where is it getting defined? Our code becomes a lot more traceable. All right, so now we've done it. So now we have capacity 3. We're up to where we were before. Now, before we move on, this syntax, as you may know, is already available to you in Vue 2 using the Composition API plugin. And some people are already using it in production. You can, oh yeah, so here we go. So it's right here. You can follow the installation options right there. The only difference from the code that I've shown you is that you need to include the different pieces of the code differently. You're going to be using this instead of just from Vue. All right, next step. How do we add a method? So if we're using the options API and we wanted to increment the capacity, we might write some code that looks something like this. All right, so how would we do that? That's our next goal. First, let's go ahead and add a button. So this button, when we click it, is going to increase the capacity that we currently have. All right, next step. Let's go ahead and bring this inside of our code, and all we need to do is declare a function called increase capacity, and then to use that inside our template, we need to expose that. We can call it inside of our template. But what goes inside this function? Could we just write capacity plus plus? That wouldn't work. Why? Because it's not an object. It's not a primitive. Reactive reference is an object. If we looked at the console, it would look something like this. And notice here it has that value. That's where our primitive is getting stored, inside value. So inside of our setup method, to get access to it, we simply need to write capacity.value plus plus. That's how we access value on a reactive reference. And now if we go inside of our browser, we can see everything is working as we would expect. All right. Now, you might be wondering, wait a second. Up here in the template, we didn't need to call .value on the template. Shouldn't we have to do that? Well, Vue 3 by default, when it finds a reference in the template, it's going to automatically expose the inner value. It notices, oh, this is a reactive reference. I know what to do with this. I'm going to print out the value. Right, so you never need to call .value inside the template. It's a nice little shortcut. All right, for our next piece of functionality, we need to build out our code a little bit. We're going to create an array called attending with the different people who are attending our event. And we want to iterate through each of these. So let's go ahead and create a for loop, pretty simple, go through each of them, print them out. Ends up looking something like that, where we have each person attending. And now that we have a list of everybody attending, it would be nice to print out how many spaces we have left in our event. So maybe we say spaces left out of total capacity. And this is a perfect example where we might want to use a computed property. And inside of our, and using our components API, it might look something like this. Right, so we have this .capacity minus this .attending .length. So the question is, how do we add the computed property using the composition API? All right, so I'm going to shrink our code a little bit, so I have a little more space. And inside here, all I need to do is write another constant, and it's going to be spaces left equals computed, right? I included it. Oh, I forgot to mention that. Yeah, I included it here in the import. And then we just use computed and send in an anonymous function. Notice here and here, I have to use value, .value for each of the items. Then I simply include it in what I send to my template, and now it works as we might expect. And as I increase capacity, it properly changes the spaces left using the computed property because of my reactive references. All right, cool. Now there's two different ways I can create reactive values in Vue 3. I can use reactive references as I just taught you, but I could also code this up using the reactive syntax like I'm about to show you. So I need to import it, and then inside my setup function, I declare reactive, and I send in an object, just like we would with the data value in the options API. So it might look something like this. Notice here, I'm just taking each of these references, and I'm representing them in an object, including the computed property. All right. And notice here, inside the computed property, I'm no longer needing to use .value because I have an object. And now, when I declare my method, which I can do down here, I'm also not using .value. Then, inside of my return, I just return the entire object. Both of these are valid syntaxes. And I'm going to leave it to Thorsten, after my talk, who's speaking right after me, to talk about the benefits and the best practices and his opinions about using one versus the other. All right, so if I use this code, that means my template is going to be a little different. My template now needs to reference event dot for each of my properties. Now, when I first saw this, I was like, what if I wanted to use this event, this object, and I wanted to somehow deconstruct it so that I wouldn't have to call .event? Can I just make it somehow so it just has these variables, which you may or may not agree is a good thing. Sometimes it's good to encapsulate all of your properties inside of an object like event. So how could I make this work? Right now, this is not going to work because I'm just sending the object. So I thought, well, can I just destructure it, like, with a ... syntax? And that didn't work, so I tried just listing them all out individually. Would that work? That's not going to work either. Why is that? Well, basically, splitting apart the object is going to remove the reactivity, because the way reactivity works with Vue 3 is it's putting it on the object, and if I split it apart, it's just not going to be there in these individual items. So how do we split these out? Well, what we want to do is split them out into reactive references, and that's why inside Vue 3, we have another piece of syntax to use called TwoRefs. So with TwoRefs, what we can do in this case to make this work is simply use this function, TwoRefs, and we do ... TwoRefs, and that basically converts a reactive object to a plain object where each property is a reactive reference pointing to the property on the original object. So this is going to work with this code. And one thing I noticed when I wrote this up is I was like, okay, it's too bad I have increased capacity in there, because without increased capacity, I could simply write return TwoRefs event. I wouldn't have to do the destructuring, right? And it would just look a little cleaner without the ... Because TwoRefs returns an array of, not an array, a bunch of, an object with all of the different references in it. All right. So here we have our code, and as I mentioned, why we want the composition API, why we want to use it, is when we want to organize component by feature, and we want to reuse across other components, which of course I'm not doing anything of yet. So let's do that now. Notice let's do that now. So I'm going to switch our code back to using refs. I think it reads a little better. So I've got that there. So first, let's organize things by feature. In order to do that, I can simply take all the code, move it out of my setup function, wrap it in a function called useEventSpace. Right, that's our composition function. And now I simply call it from inside our setup method. Simple as that. Great. So now our component is organized by feature. How might we make it so that we can reuse it across our other components? Well, for that, all I need to do is take this code, bring it out into another file. We'll call it useEventSpace.js. I need to export default so that I can import it. Then I'll import it inside of my function. And really, that's it. So it's really easy to take this code and bring it out and start making it reusable through other components, if that's what I need to do. And if I needed to add another composition function to this, well, it'd be pretty simple. I could just import it. We'll call it useMapping. And now, the way I have the return function probably wouldn't work if it was also using reactive references. And this is where I'd want to use what you saw earlier. And I just need to do ... and call that in. So it basically takes all the reactive references and includes them inside of my setup function and exposes them to the template. Just like so. Cool. So, there you have with the basics. If you like the way I teach and you like this way of visual learning, this content that I'm going through right now is part of the Vue 3 Essentials course. There's additional topics which I cover in there. And right now, I'm working on a Vue 3 reactivity course. I'm releasing another lesson next week. We already have 2. And I'm teaching the basics of what goes on under the hood with Vue 3 reactivity, which is really quite genius. I recommend you take the time to learn it because it really shows you what goes on under the hood. And next time you're debugging and you follow a stack trace, you'll recognize some of the functions. I also want to mention that we always do a promo when we go to conferences. If you've been on the fence about supporting Vue Mastery and becoming a learner with us, you can use the code AMS2020 to get 30% off an annual subscription. Also, if you haven't yet, I know some of you already grabbed this, at the booth back behind this giant screen, we're giving out Vue Mastery stickers, and we have a Vue 3 composition API cheat sheet which has all this new composition, which I just talked about, and much more. Feel free to grab one. And lastly, one thing that motivates me the most in what I do is that when you become a learner at Vue Mastery, we give 25% of our revenue, not profit, revenue, back to Vue.js, which to date, we've given back $176,000 to the project, making us the biggest supporter of Vue. And that's awesome. And if you're a Vue Mastery subscriber in the audience, thank you. We couldn't do this without developers like you that both value learning and supporting the ecosystem. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Greg. That was a really great deep dive on Vue Composition API.